I wanted to introduce David Abecassis. He's a partner in Analysys Mason's London office. Since joining the firm in 2004, he's advised clients on cutting edge topics, including public policy, economic regulation, corporate strategy, due diligence, and corporate finance. I had the pleasure of meeting David. It was almost a year ago. Lindsay and I were working on solutions to the Universal Service Fund. We saw some real gaps in information. And then we tried to figure out who could we hire that could help us figure out where the gaps are. And I was introduced to David, and I was really happy that we met David and his team, including Michael Kende, who's in the room somewhere. There's Michael. And they produced a fabulous report for us that we published in the fall of last year. And I asked David if he would come and present the report. And then we will follow up with the USF panel where we'll be able to talk a little bit more about it. But he has some additional information for us, things that are going on in Europe. So we're really looking forward to this presentation.
Thanks, Angie. Thank you very much for inviting me. So as Angie said, I'm based in London, but I grew up in France. I lived in Italy. I lived in Singapore. In addition to the core topic that I want to address, which is the investment that tech companies are making in digital infrastructure as part of this effort to bring broadband to everyone, I also want to give a perspective on what's going on elsewhere, because there's a lot of cross-fertilization in ideas, in regulatory approaches, and I think it's very important to have a sort of clear view of what we're trying to achieve and how some solutions might be better than others. So I have too many slides. I won't go through them in a lot of details. The first thing I wanted to mention is that we've talked a lot about the US efforts to bring connectivity to everyone, and we've talked about all the funding that Congress and the administration have made available to help this along in the US. There are very similar efforts being done elsewhere. In Asia, where I spent 4 years and still work a lot, South Korea has had gigabit broadband to nearly everyone since 2011. So that's over 10 years. In Singapore, it's been since 2015 roughly, and now over 80% of households use 1 or 2 gigabit broadband. In Singapore, the minister in charge of digital technology said in September that they wanted to reach 10 gigabit per second to many people in the next few years. So things are moving along quite rapidly. In Europe, the situation is much more similar to here, in that the European Commission has strong ambitions to bring gigabit connectivity to everyone by 2030 through fiber and 5G, and also to deploy 5G in all inhabited areas by 2030. These ambitions cost money, and we've heard a lot about the money that NTIA is going to administer to help providers achieve the objectives that Congress has set in the US. In Europe, there's again a similar dynamic, except in Europe, we're already at 70% coverage of gigabit broadband. And there's already been around 90 billion euros spent by private providers to get to that level. What you can see on the slide there is that there's further tens of billions committed by operators, by private investors. I think Chip mentioned private equity investors, which are a big part of the funding picture in Europe, and by governments and public administrations. There's a narrative that's been developing, and I think that's something that we've seen in the USF debate also in the US, and that you'll discuss in the forum in the panel after this presentation, which is that digital infrastructure needs to be funded not only by operators, public administrations and governments and private investors, but also directly or indirectly by tech companies, because they benefit from people being able to access broadband. And there's roughly four arguments that have been put forward to justify this point, and these are arguments that are very topical in Europe at present, but that have been made also in the record on the USF debate, which are that first, a small number of content providers are generating a lot of traffic, and second, that this traffic drives cost, and that's a bad thing. So putting these two things together, demand for content is somehow bad for networks. We'll get back to that. The third point is that if nothing changes, somehow networks won't be able to handle the growth in demand And the last point is that those who make money out of selling content online should pay. And the solution that, in particular, large telecoms operators in Europe have been advocating is for direct payments from content providers to ISPs. Now, and I don't want to go into too much detail, but the work that we've been doing, including with Angie and the team in INCOMPAS, shows quite well that none of these premises are really valid. You know, it's consumers that are dictating what goes onto networks, not content providers. If I want to watch a video on Netflix, I request it, I pay for my Netflix service, I pay for my internet access, and that's how I get value from both services. The second point around traffic driving network costs is also pretty specious, because a lot of the investment that we're talking about today is in fiber networks that have a very large amount of capacity. They're not capacity constrained, and they're going to be able to support demand for content for decades to come. In addition, and that's the third point on this slide, these networks are highly upgradable. And what you see in Singapore, for example, is this upgrade from 1 gigabit broadband to 10 gigabit broadband. It's not going to cost anything like what it costs to get to 1 gig. So there's a huge scope for expansion in these networks. And the last point, and that's what I'll show on the slides in a minute, is that tech companies are already investing in digital infrastructure, primarily, and I will skip a few slides there, but primarily in data centers, which is what we've called hosting in the study that we've published, but also in networks. So they bring traffic through submarine cable, through terrestrial fiber, in many locations. So in the United States, on land, in many other countries under sea, to exchange traffic and deliver traffic to ISPs in tens or hundreds of locations. And that's valuable for a number of reasons. They also cache content directly into ISPs networks. So there's great partnerships between ISPs and content providers that see the content being cached within networks very close to end users. So as part of the work that we did with INCOMPAS, we tried to quantify what this investment in infrastructure was like. And we found that over the last 10 to 12 years, there'd been around nearly $900 billion invested by tech companies in infrastructure. Again, a lot of this investment is in data centers, but some of it also goes into networks and caching. In Europe at the moment, there was Mobile World Congress last week. I think some of you might have been there. Operators are saying, well, they're not investing in networks, they're investing in data centers. But I think it's really important for us all to realize that if we didn't have these data centers, we would have no services online. And so if we talk about digital infrastructure, we can't just stop at the edge of a local network. We have to look at it holistically. And this is not investment that operators are making, it's investment that content providers, colocation providers, and so on are making. I've got a slide there. I'll leave it for you to look at. I think you'll all get the slides, but around the picture in North America, over a third of this investment has been done in North America. It's still progressing at pace. So more than half of the investment over the last 12 years has been in the last 3 years. So it's an investment that's accelerating rapidly. And this picture is replicated in other regions of the globe, including Europe and Asia. And we've got that in the paper that we published. A couple of slides there just to articulate really the synergies that exist between the investments that content providers are making and the economics of ISPs. So really, if we want to be able to have networks that are able to handle the applications of the future at gigabit speeds, we need an end-to-end infrastructure that's going to be able to deliver this content and these applications. What we can see, so I've talked a little bit about the importance of investment in hosting. That's already happening. What we've also done as part of the work that we've done with INCOMPAS is to try and articulate the cost savings that ISPs are getting from being able to get traffic from peering points that are close to their networks, where they can easily expand, and also from caches that can be hosted directly in their networks. And these savings are significant, even with very conservative assumptions. And I'd be happy to discuss if you have questions afterwards. We estimated that the annual saving to ISPs globally was in the billions of dollars. And this is, as I said, a very conservative estimate. Another point that's being made quite widely is that somehow traffic is causing costs in networks. And in some ways, that could be true. So, as soon as you have a network that's shared between people, and that has a limited capacity, then potentially if you have traffic that exceeds this capacity, you might have to upgrade the network. Well, in fiber networks, that's not really true. So fiber optics have capacities that are orders of magnitude in excess of what people are consuming today, and even of what people will consume in 20 or 30 years in access networks, which is really what we need to fund today. In core networks, backbones, I know middle mile is a particular issue in the US, and I think you might talk about it in the panel afterwards. But fiber has been here for decades, and it's an incremental investment that's a relatively small amount of cost compared to what it costs to deploy fiber to every home. And so what we can see is that the investment in network costs, so including the maintenance of the networks, has been very stable over time. So this is a global picture that you can see in the green bar there. And that supported a threefold increase in traffic in the last few years. Yes, capacity costs money, but once you've deployed these very high capacity networks, you can handle a really huge amount of traffic without spending that much more money. I will skip this. I think there's also a really important and really interesting discussion to be had about a sort of demand gap that might be emerging now. So I said in Europe, we have 70% coverage of gigabit broadband, but the take-up is only around half that. So people are not really seeing the benefits of fiber yet, and I think that's a really important question for us all to ask ourselves: is how do we make fiber valuable to people, right? And some of the research that we've done shows that folks that are interested in advanced applications are also interested in upgrading their broadband. So this synergy, I mean, it sounds obvious, but it's not something that that's well exploited yet in the market. I'll skip these slides because I think Michael will mention some of this in the USF panel. But I will close on perhaps just a call for us all to focus on things that are on things that are constructive. And I'm really happy to be here today because I think all of the discussions that we've had today have been extremely constructive, focusing on removing barriers to deployment, focusing on working together to ensure that the deployment of fiber goes apace at an appropriate cost. And it's to, I think, INCOMPAS's credit also to have these programs that are focusing on reducing the cost of deployment. There's clearly a lot of public investment both in the US and elsewhere that's going into supporting these networks. And I will also just reiterate this point that nobody wants fiber to their home in order to display it in their living room. They want it to do cool stuff with, and I think it's up to us all, including the tech companies that are also part of INCOMPAS, to develop these services that people will want to use fiber for. Thank you very much. I'll stop there. Hopefully I didn't overrun too much.
Thank you, David. That was really great.